The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 6. Part 7. The kingdom of Domemba was small and simple, but His Majesty lived in great luxury. Arian asked Kush. What is the reason for the king's wealth? Precious stones. Domemba has a subsoil rich in gems and diamonds, so abundant that the king is even the envy of the dwarfs. Understand? Replied the young woman astonished. The king is so rich that he can buy everything he wants. That's why Albiona longs to conquer his kingdom. He wants Domemba's fortune. Why don't they attack? I mean, Albiona is a powerful kingdom and the king rules over a fairly small territory. Why don't they conquer them? The magician smiled slightly at Arian's question. The king looks like a kind and capricious person because of his appearance. But he is a very skilled politician. First, he is allied with all the kingdoms in the area. They have formed a league, the League of the Dragon's Back. So if Albiona attacks Domemba, he will declare war on all the other kingdoms and is no longer such an insignificant rival. And then there's something else. Which one? Gold. You don't need to recruit an army. You are so rich that you can buy the best mercenaries in the world. Albiona would not be facing a group of peasants, but well-trained and expert warriors, and that makes the Jewel of the South think very seriously about its possibilities before launching into the conquest of the rich kingdom of Domemba. Arian remained silent, so the mercenaries were here, the king paying very generously for their expensive services. After 2 days' journey, they arrived at the capital of the kingdom of Domemba, which had the same name as the kingdom. It could not be called a city exactly, it was exclusively His Majesty's palace. The idea of its construction was his and only his servants, family and guests were allowed to enter. No inhabitant of Domemba could build in its surroundings but could go to the palace to attend an audience or pay tribute. The huge building was made of white granite, and once they passed the walls they saw that the affirmation, the king's fortune, was enormous. The palace was full of fountains and gardens, gold abounded in every detail. It was a very pleasant place with wide avenues that all ended in the central part where the royal palace was, and with great towers that shone in the sky. They left the wagon and received them to Lasgama effusively. He was concerned about the state of Arian and led them directly into the presence of the king. In the audience hall they found His Majesty, who has always received the 2 young women with joy. My dear. You're recovered. The king exclaimed as he embraced the young woman with great effusiveness, so much so that Arian could hardly speak. Now we can celebrate the victory. Tonight there will be a dinner in your honor. Trumpet sounds, servants threw rose petals at the king and the young women, and everyone went crazy. A frenzied activity began to prepare the gala dinner. Meanwhile, Arian and Vanus were lodged in the apartments of the king's daughters, where they were treated with all the comforts and luxuries. The baths were huge and exquisitely decorated with scented water and fruity bath salts. Arian recovered from the trip though. She was reluctant to be helped to bathe. Vanus completely refused. If she bathed, it was something she would do alone. They were dressed in the finest garments. Arian wore a simple silk suit with blue gold thread and leather sandals with an exquisite finish. They perfumed her with an essence of spring roses. She had never seen anything like it in her life. For the Kendali, the king had a surprise, a custom-made tunic, a fabric a little lighter than hers, but that as always he totally hid her. Afterwards they were left alone in those rooms. The servants informed her that the feast would begin as was tradition in Domemba at sunset. From his bed, Arian could see through a huge window the palace, its enormous gardens and the different palaces that made it up. He observed the numerous fountains with large ponds where the birds drank and rested. It felt as if the king's palace was a piece of paradise. At sunset, the palace was plunged into darkness. The white moon dominated the night. Since its sister, the blue moon, today had to disappear. That indicated that summer was in full swing. Still, despite the fact that with the full white moon the clarity was much greater, the torches, lamps and candles were lit. Following a servant they advanced through the corridors and halls until they reached a huge courtyard full of guests. The open ceiling revealed the starry sky and was decorated with exotic flowers. They had been informed that it was customary in Domemba for guests to gather informally before the dinner itself, while eating and drinking the dishes served at a large central table richly decorated with flowers and statues. As soon as the king saw the two young women in the room, he gave them all his attention, hugged them again, and again Arian was breathless. "Beloved, you are most beautiful. I compliment them, but come in, eat and have fun, this is your home." The monarch pointed to where the food and drink were, a table in the center of the huge room that was filled with fruit, meat, hors d'oeuvres, and multiple drinks. Behind the king was Kush dressed in a white robe. It wasn't his wizard's robe. He looked much better and no longer sported a sloppy goatee and was more relaxed. But it was the king who was still talking to Arian and the Kendeli. "Dear ones, today we celebrate that our expedition has been a resounding success. We have reopened the southern road and I have plans to keep that route open permanently." Two new guests, some ambassadors, arrived at the feast, and the king had to leave them to give them a formal greeting, so they were left alone with the magician. "How was your stay in Domemba?" "Well, don't worry, it's a nice place." Arian replied that he had not traveled so much to be able to compare with such an experienced criterion as that of the magician. "Yes, you can see the power generated by precious stones. Since His Highness's grandfather defeated the dwarfs, this kingdom does not stop growing in power and influence." Arian noticed that the party was too quiet. He noticed someone's absence. "And Gosberg?" Kush smiled again and pointed his eyes to the young woman to stand in a large group at the end of the courtyard. There was the Denkka chatting with a dwarf with short blonde hair and a rectangular goatee, not what Arian expected from a dwarf. Next to them and listening to the conversation between the Denkka and the dwarf was a huge orc with grey skin and huge fangs. He was scary, but no one seemed intimidated by his presence. A very heterogeneous group. "If they are all members of our mercenary company." Arian looked at the magician in surprise. She expected a company of men only. Kush raised an eyebrow before speaking. "Yes, maybe it's a bit strange. The dwarf's name is Kritus Blackrock and the orc's name is Mulak Utharakan." The young woman watched them carefully. She had grown up among men. Perhaps she had seen a dwarf who wanted to trade her wares or a dead snow troll. But now the sight of orcs and dwarfs rubbing shoulders with the cream of Domemba was strange to him. And he appeared. She greeted the other three mercenaries. He was not very tall, barely 6 feet tall. Arian immediately recognized him. He was the young man who had rescued her from the bandits in the Battle of the Deadlands. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders, her black eyes were vivid, she had neat and beautiful facial features. He was like a little brother of Agnorak. "That's the one who saved me from the bandits." I point Arian to Kush. "Yes, Aris, our captain." The other half-orc. Arian spoke more to himself than to Kush. Now that he was watching the group, he noticed an obvious resemblance between Mulak and Aris. He couldn't help but have that conversation with Kush before crossing the lower pass. They look a lot alike since they are cousins. Kush had guessed Arian's thoughts. "Cousins?" the young woman exclaimed. They were so different and alike at the same time. Gosberg realized that they were being watched and walked over to the magician, the Kendeli, and the young woman. "My dear, I am glad to see you. You are now fully recovered. I wanted to stay by your side, but Aris felt that I should continue on the road with the caravan." "Don't worry, Gosberg, Kush has taken very good care of me. Don't trust that magician, he seems very serious, but be careful with him." "Shut up, damn it." Just then a trumpet sounded signaling to the guests that it was time to sit down at the table, as dinner was about to begin. At the table of honor sat a representation of the mercenaries, indicating their importance to His Highness. On the right sat Kush, on the left Aris. Then the rest of the mercenaries, Agnorak, the dwarf, 3 orcs, one of them was Gulak, and a huge Denkka who sat next to Gosberg. That Denkka was a giant. He sat on the floor as there was no chair capable of supporting his weight, an impressive being, but despite his size he was well proportioned and had agile movements. Arian and the Kendeli sat at the second table, presided over by Prime Minister Losgama, who sat next to them. Arian could not stop watching his savior throughout the night, who spoke animatedly with the king and Kush. None of them ate the delicacies that were served to them. They must have been dealing with very serious subjects. Aras had very elegant gestures, but his black eyes looked coldly at everything that was happening around him. "Do you like it too?" It was the voice of one of the princesses named Nazmarina, young and foolish. She was sitting next to Arian, and this question made her bow her head in embarrassment. "Who?" Arian tried to pretend to be absent-minded, but in an unconvincing way. Aras, the Black General, was the first to defeat the elves in centuries, a hero to the Dark Empire, but ended up exiled due to problems with the new emperor and became a mercenary in the company of the Blue Phoenix. "It's unbelievable that you don't know him. He doesn't look like such a legendary warrior." Arian tried to justify his ignorance. "That's why my father likes it. Believe me, my father has hired the best, and without a doubt they have a deserved fame. They are also quite normal, you can even talk to them. The other one isn't bad either." "Who?" Arian was pretending to be absent-minded. "The other half-orc, much wilder and rougher, I may like better." Agnorok was a little lost at dinner. You could tell that it wasn't his environment. He was attending to the conversation with little interest since the topic they were talking about was something that didn't concern him. The half-orc saw how Arian was looking at them and lowered his gaze.